Hello and welcome to the show. I am Joe Tophat. I'm sure many of you have already heard that Steve Ditko, the co-creator of characters such as Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, has died. He was 90 years old. It's never easy to lose a legend like Steve Ditko. And it's also kind of difficult to talk about the man because of how private he kept his life. But for today's video, I kind of want to pay tribute to him. My first exposure to Spider-Man was from the 90s animated series. God, that was a great show. My dad owned a collection of old Spider-Man comics, and I would read them every chance I got. And the ones he didn't have, I would go to the library and check out old trade paperbacks. For the longest time, I thought that Stan Lee had drawn as well as write the Spider-Man comics. Every time he appeared on TV, he was always introduced as creator of Spider-Man. In retrospect, I should have known better, because the comics had always credited Steve Ditko as the artist of Spider-Man, but I guess being the kid, I was always more interested in reading the story than the credits. The first time I became aware of Steve Ditko was when they did the PS1 game and Stan Lee was doing the intro and he introduced himself as Spider-Man co-creator. I found that odd at the time because up until then he was always credited as the sole creator of Spider-Man. I later on did some research and learned about Steve Ditko. To be honest with you, what I read about him made me hate the man. I feel kind of bad to admit that, but it's the truth. And as principled as Steve Ditko was, I would think he would want me to admit that. Everything I had read about him made him seem stubborn, uptight, and pig-headed. And part of it was from Stan Lee's own autobiography, where he portrayed Steve Ditko as having a chip on his shoulder over co-creating Spider-Man. It also didn't help that I saw that In Search of Steve Ditko documentary on the BBC, where everybody on there was trashing his objectivist views and made him seem like a crazy nut job. It also seemed insane that he would leave something as beloved as Spider-Man as well as Doctor Strange to do these weird comics about his objectivist views. And not to mention the fact that he more or less didn't want to talk to anybody. So I admired his work, but I didn't admire the man. What made me change my mind? I actually studied him from people who weren't biased against him. You see, like other people, I misunderstood what the man was. A very highly principled one. Him being as reclusive as he wasn't something that just came out of nowhere or out of bitterness to the world. He just was never a talkative person, and it was something I could relate to. I was never very talkative. So many celebrities allow their private lives to overshadow their work, whether it's a messy affair or a messy breakup, whatever crime they committed, you name it. Once those big scandals erupt, it far overshadows any work they created. Ditko never allowed that to happen. He often said that it's not his personality he's selling, it's a product, i.e., the comics. He felt people should get to know him through his work, and not because they love him personally. And it was something I happen to agree with. The only known audio of his voice was in that documentary about comic book greats, but instead of talking about himself, he talked about his most famous creation he made after leaving Marvel, Mr. A. I listened to what he said about Ayn Rand and Aristotle, and it was mind-blowing how intelligent this man was. There are so many people out there who read snippets of well-known books like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, since we're talking about Steve Ditko, and they would pretend like they know everything there is to know on the subject, even though they obviously had only read snippets and totally misunderstand what Ayn Rand was saying. I'm the first to admit I don't fully understand objectivism. There are plenty of people out there who could explain it better than I can. But I would listen to Ditko, and he sounded like a man who actually read the book and understood it completely. So many people pretend to be intellectuals, and yet Ditko seemed like he was an intellectual. And was I mistaken for pig-headedness, it was just him following his principles. He was such a big believer in objectivism that he was unwilling to do anything to compromise it. I may not agree with everything he believed in, but in a lot of ways, I found that admirable. How many of us can honestly say our convictions are so strong that we are unwilling to compromise? His unwillingness to compromise probably cost him a lot of money. I would read from editors who state that he would refuse so many different jobs because they compromised his outlook of what a superhero should be. He was not a believer in the anti-heroes that became popular in the 70s, nor did he believe that superheroes should be flawed. And that philosophy led to some rather unusual choices and assignments, like doing the Chuck Norris comic, a pro wrestling comic, a Transformers coloring book, a Frisch's comic. He even worked on Tiny Toons. Tiny Toons? Boy. It's kind of weird to think that Steve Ditko would draw a Tiny Toons comic. But if these comics followed his principles and he felt comfortable working on them, I say so be it. Nobody really knows why Ditko chose to leave Spider-Man at the height of the character's popularity. The only theory I can come up with was creative differences with Stan Lee and his dissatisfaction for not getting the credit he deserved. According to someone who met Steve Ditko towards the end of his life, I'll provide the link in the description to his video. Ditko had actually made amends with Stan Lee towards the end, and it's actually really nice to know, if true, that him and Stan Lee were on good terms. It's never good to leave angry at somebody. I have read some of his other work, such as his Ted Kord Blue Beetle, his character The Question, and of course Mr. A. I have to admit, the stories he wrote that reflected his objectivist views are surprisingly well written. I haven't read his much later work that he did for Robin Schneider, but the early stuff with the Blue Beetle, The Question, and Mr. A, I actually thought was pretty good. I'm not sure I fully agreed with everything he had to say, but it made me fascinated with objectivism and what it's all about, and I think, if that was his goal, mission accomplished. Not long ago, Robin Schneider had announced a 20th Kickstarter campaign they were doing, only titled Something Big. It was very tight-lipped of what that project was about, and truth be told, I don't know what it was. It's sort of ironic that after the big announcement that this new project was going to be something we hadn't seen before, Steve Ditko passed on. It was almost like this something big was his death. If there's one thing that Steve Ditko should be remembered for, it's that he was an artist of great integrity. He did what he loved to do, and he didn't worry about what fans like myself thinks of it. He wanted to create an objectivist superhero, and he did. Rest in peace, Mr. Ditko. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later.